Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants are currently on a listen-only mode until a question and answer period towards the end. Today's webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the webinar over to your host, Stacy, from the U.S. Census Bureau. Stacy, you may begin.
Thanks, Anthony. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar about the 2020 Census Supplemental Demographic and Housing Characteristics File. We'll call it the S-DHC going forward. I'm Stacy Vidal from the Census Bureau's Public Information Office, and I'm joined by three subject matter experts: Evan Brissell, the Assistant Division Chief for Housing Characteristics from our Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division; Michael Hawes, a Senior Statistician for Scientific Communication; and Scott Holen, a Senior Research Fellow in our Research and Methodology Director. Forgive me. So we plan to cover a lot of information about today's release to help you prepare, or a lot of information today to help you prepare for this week's release. As its name implies, the supplemental DHC supplements information that we released in the Demographic and Housing Characteristics file last year. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means, explain what the tables and geographies will be available, and we'll talk you through some guidance and things to expect when you use the data. As we go, feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We have subject matter experts on standby to answer them. We'll also take questions verbally at the end of our presentation. If we can't get to your question today, or you have others, we'll provide some contact information for you to connect with us afterward. So let's dive in, first with some logistics. We'll provide the data on embargo beginning around 10 a.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, September 17th. We'll lift the embargo at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, September 19th. The news release will go live on our website at 12:01 a.m., and we expect the data to be live on data.census.gov by 10 a.m. If you would like to register for embargo access, we'll drop the link in the chat, along with a login page if you're already a subscriber. Please note that you must be accredited media and you must abide by the embargo policy. With that, let me turn it over to Evan, who will talk a little bit more about the data product. Evan?
Thanks, Stacy. I'll give you a few key points to keep in mind about the SDHC, and then we'll dive into the details. First, as Stacy mentioned, the SDHC combines characteristics about people and households. Specifically, the SDHC provides statistics for the average size of families and households, as well as the counts of people living in certain types of households. We'll give some examples of what we mean, and Michael will explain some of the implications for disclosure avoidance. Secondly, 6 of the 8 tables in the SDHC will also be available by race and Hispanic origin. We'll show you which groups and how to find them in the data. As we think about the SDHC combining characteristics, let's talk about where the information comes from. The SDHC reflects data from questions across the breadth of the 2020 census, including age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, relationship to the householder, and tenure, or whether or not the home is owned or rented. Here are a list of the 8 tables. You'll note that 6 of them have asterisks. These are all available by race and Hispanic origin. And these are the 9 race and ethnicity groups available. Excuse me. Note that unlike the detailed DHCP released in August, the SDHC does not provide information for detailed race and ethnicity groups or American Indian and Alaskan Native tribes and villages. The SDHC just provides information for the race alone, the 2 or more races, Hispanic or Latino, and the white alone, not Hispanic populations. Now, let me give a couple examples to illustrate how the SDHC provides something a little different than what we had in the DHC. In this example, the DHC told us how many married couple households had children living in them. We refer to this as the presence of children in the tables. This was really just a fact about the household. In a separate table, the DHC told us about the number of children in the geography and characteristics about the people there. In the SDHC, we get the number of children who live in a married couple families. In this case, we're learning about both the people in the household and the household itself. We're learning about the age of the people to know about the children, and we're learning about the household. In this case, it's looking at household type to tell us about married couple families. As another example, the DHC told us how many households own their home with a mortgage or loan. That's a characteristic about the household. With the SDHC, we can layer onto that information the number of people as well. In this case, we'll learn how many people lived in households that were owned with a mortgage or loan. Next, let's talk about geography. Let's talk about geography. The SDHC tables are only available for the nation's 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. The SDHC tables are not available for geographies below the nation and state level. The SDHC is provided for limited geographies because of concerns about meeting data quality and accuracy standards given confidentiality considerations. All right, now on to this slide. There are a few things to keep in mind if you consider comparing the SDHC data to data from 2010. In terms of race, we made a variety of improvements to how we collected, coded, and tabulated race data this decade. We would encourage you to use caution and take these improvements into account if you compare the 2020 census to the 2010 census race data. We'll link to a blog in today's press kit that explains more about these improvements. The same caution also applies to comparing the 2020 census race data to the American Community Survey, ACS, estimates. The 2020 census provides the official counts, including Hispanic origin and race, of the population, and the ACS provides estimates of additional characteristics, adding rich context to the understanding of the nation's population. We implemented these same improvements in the ACS starting in 2020. As a result, use caution when comparing the 2020 census Asian, NHPI, and AIN race data with the 2019 or earlier ACS. However, the 2020 census Hispanic origin data from the ethnicities questions are comparable with the 2010 census and with the ACS regardless of year. Whew. All right, household type. If you would like to compare the household data from 2020 with 2010, one thing to note is that the count of married couple households, family households, and non-family households are affected by the presence of same-sex married couple households in the 2020 census data. For the 2010 census data products, which were produced before the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage throughout the United States, households who reported as same-sex married couple households without children or other relatives present were edited and shown as unmarried partners and included in the non-family households unless there is another person present who was related to the household by birth, marriage, or adoption. For the 2020 census, these households are included in the estimate of families because they are married couples. The same is also true for the American Community Survey, so these 2020 census data are generally comparable with the ACS data. In addition, the naming convention for specific household types have been updated in the 2020 census data products to reflect the presence of same-sex married couple households. Labels that previously referred to husband-wife families now refer to married couple families, which include both opposite sex and same-sex married couples. Additionally, labels that previously referred to male householder no wife present now refer to male householder no spouse present. And labels that previously referred to female householder no husband present now refer to female householder no spouse present. The bottom line is that all married couple families are now included in the family households in all tables. The number of same-sex married couples is relatively small, so it's something to keep in mind when comparing to 2010. There are no major changes to how the 10-year question was asked from 2010, so the 2020 census housing data are generally comparable to the 2010 census as well as the ACS. Next, I'll note that the American Community Survey provides tables with similar data subjects as the SDHC, but they're not exactly the same. The SDHC data are more recent, having been released for the 2021, 2022, and 2023 ACS 1 year. They are also available for lower-level geographies such as county. It is important to note, however, that the ACS estimates are based on a sample survey and are subject to error, including sampling error. So, with that said, I'd like to highlight that SDHC are unique and they reflect counts of the population. They're based on the census, not just a sample of the population, and therefore have many, many more responses going into this data. These data are important benchmarks for us moving forward throughout the decade as we compare it to the ACS and other surveys. Now, I'll finally turn it over to Michael to talk through some guidance.
Great, thank you, Evan. So the SDHC is a little different from some of the other 2020 census data products. So I'm going to walk you through a few things to think about as you explore and use the SDHC data. So the Census Bureau is using a disclosure avoidance framework known as differential privacy. to protect the confidentiality of individual census response information. Differential privacy protects against disclosure of confidential census information by adding statistical noise, which is kind of random additions or subtractions to each of the published statistics to reduce the likelihood that characteristics or attributes about a specific person or household can be accurately inferred using any combination of the published data. For the SDHC, this disclosure avoidance process is achieved through the pH-safe algorithm. Now, linked person and household data have higher disclosure risk than either the person data or the household data alone. So in order to address this greater disclosure risk, pH-safe adds an additional disclosure avoidance step that is not applied to other 2020 census data products in order to further protect the confidentiality of households' characteristics. Whenever the count of people within an enumerated household exceeds a set threshold based on the number of people in the household, individuals are removed or truncated at random from that household until the household meets the household size threshold. The thresholds that we used for this process are as follows. 10 people for tables P2, which is population in households, P4, which is population in families, and PH7, which is population in occupied housing units, and 6 people for tables PH3, which is population under 18 years in households, and PH6, which is own children under 18 years. Following the truncation step, pH-safe produces preliminary tabulations of characteristics and then adds or subtracts noise to those results to produce a set of preliminary counts that are referred to as noisy measurements. Under differential privacy, the amount of noise that's added or subtracted to those counts to protect confidentiality is determined by a privacy loss budget. And if you've been following our disclosure avoidance in other 2020 census data products, you'll be familiar with this concept of a privacy loss budget for a data product. The SDHC's privacy loss budget was set in order to meet predetermined accuracy targets for the noisy measurements of the truncated but not enumerated values. The noisy measurements then undergo an innovative statistical post-processing step to produce the published SDHC statistics and their associated credible intervals. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So with all of this in mind, there's some user guidance regarding some inconsistencies that you might find in the data resulting from the noise infusion process that we use to protect confidentiality. For starters, don't expect consistency across different SDHC tables. For example, the total population in households from table PH2 would normally match total population in occupied housing units in table PH7. But because of the independent addition or subtraction of statistical noise in those two tables, it often does not. So use the total from table PH7 whenever possible because it has less noise than the total from table PH2. Similarly, don't expect consistency when aggregating SDHC data and comparing it to other SDHC statistics. For example, summing data across table PH2, which is the household type for population in households, across different states may not match the national total. And summing race iterations A through G may not match the sum of the total household population count. Also, don't expect consistency between the SDHC and other 2020 census data products. For example, total population in households from table PH2 may not match the total population in households from the DHC table P5, which is population in households by age. And lastly, use caution when aggregating published counts to produce statistics for custom groups or geographies. Aggregations of the SDHC data get noisier in proportion to the number of counts that are included in the aggregation. Also, be aware that household size averages are impacted by the truncation of those very large households in that truncation step, and that the magnitude of these effects may vary by geography and demographic group. Now I'll turn it over to Scott to discuss some of the innovative characteristics of this data product through the SDHC statistical post-processing and the resulting credible intervals. Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I'm going to describe a little bit about the statistical post-processing that was used for the SDHC. And the first thing to recall, Michael gave a nice overview of this, was the privacy of the truncated enumerated counts are protected using a form of differential privacy. So when doing this, when we're applying the disclosure avoidance methodology, this results, as Michael alluded to a noisy privacy protected truncated count. And the privacy protected truncated count, it inherits all of the formal privacy guarantees that after going through this statistical post-processing procedure as the original inputs, and that's really important. So there are privacy guarantees related to this data. And the motivation for the SPP statistical post-processing is that it reduces the implausible results, and I'll get to that in a moment. It also improves accuracy, and then importantly, it's going to provide an accurate measure of uncertainty, which is related to the disclosure avoidance methodology. So the SPP approach that we, and I'm using SPP to be the abbreviation for statistical post-processing here. It starts with the noisy privacy protected measurements. And then taking the privacy protected measurements, we use a Bayesian approach, and we couple that with the logical constraints in the data. So one of the logical constraints that's obvious is that you can't have a negative count. You can't have a negative number of people. So we enforce things such as non-negativity. Also, when considering estimates like the ratios, then you wouldn't want to have a 0 in the denominator. So we enforce all of those logical constraints, and in doing so, that helps improve the accuracy of the disseminated measurements. The SPP then generates a new set of estimates, and the new set of estimates, as I alluded to, are typically more precise relative to the truncated enumerated counts than the noisy measurements themselves. And the SPP also corrects some of the implausible data and then generates this accuracy measurement known as a credible interval, which Mike alluded to. And I'll explain on the next slide what a credible interval actually means. So similar to MOEs are a 90% confidence interval. The credible interval represents a range of values that contain the truncated enumerated value with 90% probability. So you have this range. And then what we say is that the true truncated enumerated value lies within that range with 90% probability or likelihood. And the confidence intervals here, or the credible intervals, I should say, don't provide an estimate of the expected error introduced by the truncation or non-disclosure avoidance error, such as coverage error. So what we're really measuring here with the uncertainty is the uncertainty that corresponds to the disclosure avoidance mechanism. The credible intervals are produced for both counts and ratios. And importantly, in practice, this SPP approach naturally provides a principal measure of accuracy as a byproduct of the procedure. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when we apply the disclosure avoidance methodology to the truncated enumerated counts, that happens for the numerators and the denominators in the ratio separately. So if we didn't have this methodology, this Bayesian approach, then we would have to rely on some pretty sophisticated distribution theory in order to get principled measures of uncertainty for the ratios. So that would be significantly more difficult. So go here and pass it back to Stacy.
Thanks, Scott. So now let's talk about, sorry, one moment as my slides catch up to me. We're going to talk about the data resources that will be available. So the data will be available on data.census.gov, and I'll give some tips for navigating to those data on that site in just a moment. We'll also have the data available on the Census Bureau's application program interface, or our API. We do not plan to have a summary file available for this particular product because it's relatively small in terms of the number of tables and the number of geographies. And therefore, it's relatively straightforward to download the data in bulk from data.census.gov. So let's talk about some tips for navigating the data. Sorry, I'm jumping around again. I'm doing this in a different way. If you can't tell, than we usually do. So I apologize for being a little clunky here. So as far as tips, we will have links from our tip sheet available and from our press kit that will take you right into the SDHC data tables on data.census.gov. From there, you'll just need to select the geography you're interested in, whether that's a nation or one or more states. Optionally, you could also use the topics filter to further narrow down the tables if you happen to go into the one that lists all of the tables out. We do plan to have some direct links from our press kit that will take you to each one of the individual 8 tables. But if you go to the full data set and want to narrow it down a little bit, for example, you could click on topics, and then if you're interested in children, you could click on families and living arrangements, and then from there, children. Or if you're interested in the tables that look at home ownership or renting, you could select the housing topic, and then from there, that would narrow down to some of the tables that are about tenure. If you're interested in certain race groups, you could select the race and ethnicity topic from that list. Keep in mind, though, that each of the race and ethnicity groups available have their own table ID, like Evan showed on an earlier slide. So you should be able to see the available list of groups for each table without necessarily having to even filter for them. So during the embargo period, and on release day, we'll have resources available that go into a lot more detail about how to use data.census.gov, or even a little bit about the API than what I've shared with you already. So we'll have some short videos with examples. We'll also have how-to guides, basically PDF documents with some screenshots and instructions. And these will talk about using data.census.gov, including downloading and exporting the data. And two of those how-to guides and videos will also address using the API. So if you need any assistance in finding and using the data, please feel free to reach out to us and we can help walk you through it. And I'll provide contact information in just a moment. We'll also host another webinar on September 24th, entirely dedicated to walking you through finding the data on data.census.gov. The technical documentation will also include some examples. Which brings me to a list of technical resources. So we have a product planning crosswalk available on the press kit, and I'll drop the link to the press kit in the chat in a few moments. It shows the table shells for the SDHC, or what the rows of data will look like. We'll have technical documentation. This includes more detailed explanations and examples of some of the topics that we've covered throughout today's webinar. And this we expect will also be available during the embargo period. We're working on a brief that describes the disclosure avoidance methodology used to protect the SDHC. It will cover truncation and the credible intervals that Michael and Scott talked about today as well. The brief will also provide guidance for data users and should be ready for on release day. The final set of resources I'll talk about are related to content, the content that will be available. Today, we published a blog that recaps and summarizes much of what we've talked about during today's webinar. And during the embargo period and on release day, we'll have a tip sheet that points you to the data set. And similarly, we're working on an America Count story that examines the number of people living in coupled households. That is when the householder has a spouse or partner living with them. So we're working to have that available during the embargo period and on release day as well. So before we move to questions, let me recap the timing and logistics. The data will be available on embargo beginning around 10 a.m. Tuesday, September 17th, and we'll lift the embargo at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, September 19th. The news release will go live on our website at 12:01 a.m., and we expect the data to be live on data.census.gov by 10 a.m. If you would like to register for embargo access, we'll drop the link in the chat along with the login page if you're already a subscriber. And please note that you must be accredited media and must abide by the embargo policy. So now let's move to questions. Evan, Michael, Scott, and I are joined by some additional subject matter experts whom we may call upon to help answer your questions. And thanks, I think a few of you have been using the Q&A feature. We've been trying to answer those as we go. We may answer some of those out loud if that's helpful for more folks. And so if you would like to ask a question, feel free to keep using the Q&A feature if you like, or please feel free to use the raise hand feature. You should see it down kind of at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll try to answer those questions in the way that they come in. When you do ask a question, we ask that you please state your name and your media affiliation or your organization. And because we want to give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions, we ask that you just ask one question and one follow-up. And if we can't get to your question today, or you have others following the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us at the Public Information Office, either by email at pio@census.gov or by phone at 301-763-3030. Let's see, while we wait for maybe a first verbal question come in, let me just highlight another really great resource for you, either on this product or any of our other products at the Census Bureau, is that resource is our data dissemination and training program. If you are looking for further assistance on how to obtain or understand census data, our data dissemination specialists, or DDSs, are located across the country, and they can help you with that assistance. These specialists usually provide help in English, but sometimes are available in other languages as well. Whether conducting one-on-one webinars with business startups or conducting large-scale presentations at universities, these specialists strive to put the public in touch with the data they need. And our DDSs provide a wide variety of assistance for free. If you're interested in a specific type of training or presentation, please reach out to a specialist in your area using the contact information on the slide. So let me go to our list here. I don't see anyone's hands raised, so please don't feel shy. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And let me check in. I have Caroline on, who's helping me watch for questions in the chat. Are there any that we need to answer out loud at this point?
We're still trying to pick out the right person to answer some of the questions, but everything is under control.
Good deal. And you know what? I do see one now. Jonathan Buttle, would you may ask yours now, and when you're prompted, just hit make sure you hit unmute.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, two-part question. First of all, earlier in the presentation, you had mentioned no zero denominators. How, for this data product, are you handling zero estimates that might result from differential privacy being applied to the data? And second question, you talked about credible intervals. Is the interpretation of those similar to a confidence interval? So in other words, you have a 90% probability that the true estimate is within that particular interval. How would we explain this to other people?
Thank you for this question. So I'm hearing about the zero estimates and also about credible intervals. Maybe we can take those one at a time. Michael or Scott?
I can take that question. So can you repeat the first question so that I can handle them one at a time? Maybe you can repeat the first one.
Yeah, sure. So the first one has to do with, you had talked about no zero denominators. My question is, how is the pH safe handling zero estimates that might result from applying differential privacy?
Yeah, so let me try to answer that, and if you can, if I don't answer your question, she'll direct you and we can answer it afterwards. But the pH safe algorithm has the noisy inputs. As I understand it, I didn't run the pH safe algorithm. That's why I want to make sure I answer your question. Is that that could have a zero estimate, but when the noisy measurement file, that's not the final dissemination. So when you add the noise, you could get a negative answer, but when we do this statistical post-processing, the constraints are added back in so that when you have your final output, it isn't zero or negative. Does that answer your question?
So one of the constraints that you're applying then means that you'll have no zero returns. Is that correct?
I don't recall that specifically, whether it's non-negative or whether it's positive. So I'd have to look at that. I'd have to look back, but we've enforced it. So there's certainly no negative numbers, but I can't recall if there's any zeros in the data. Evan might recall if there's any zeros, but I don't recall.
All right, I'm working to answer some of the questions in the chat. No, I don't believe there are any zeros in the data.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. And with regards to your second question about credible intervals, the interpretation is that the true or the truncated enumerated count would appear in that interval with 90% probability.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just checking if anyone else has their hand raised. I don't think so at the moment. I'm gonna just check with my colleagues. I know there's some in the chat we're trying to help answer right in the chat, but if there's any that we want to just go ahead and say out loud, because sometimes it's a little easier to just talk through it than to type it up, let's go ahead and do that too.
Yeah, I'm just going to start from the bottom and work my way up. So I see Kevin put in something regarding the national and state average, or since SDHC is only available at the national and state, how do we obtain decennial average household size data at smaller geographies? So, you know, we would recommend obviously using the American Community Survey because those are official estimates. There was a working paper or a report published showing different methodologies to calculate averages using the demographic and housing characteristics file. For example, you could use the household size variable from the DHC coupled with the overall number of households to kind of back into that. And so that paper lays out different methods of doing that. Obviously, those aren't the official estimates, and we would recommend, if you recall, us to use the American Community Survey. But that paper does explain different ways to get at that. And I see Nick published something about the DHCC, and Alexandra just answered that. So this will be the last 2020 census data product that is going out the door. I believe there's a question here. When examining data for small communities, say populations 100 to 750, should we expect that privacy measures may significantly affect data quality? I believe in the technical documentation that will be going live on Thursday alongside the data release, we'll be publishing the amount of noise infusion associated with a given table estimate. So you can see how much noise was infused for a given estimate. So because the reason I have to give that vague answer is it differs based on nation versus state, as well as if you're looking at, say, the unattributed estimates, so no race, no ethnicity, or by different race or ethnicity groups. We have different levels of noise infused for each of those estimates. So I would encourage you, if you have a particular table or subject in mind, to consult the technical documentation. That will give you an idea of the level of noise infused for each estimate by table as well. Do you have any cautions or insight how to use both pulse survey data and ACS data when trying to understand local housing related issues? You know, that's slightly out of scope here, but I'll take it anyway. I would encourage you, when using any of our products, to consult the technical documentation or the associated margin of error. We also do have, or not margin, table notes. So all our tables that we publish will have notes in there that will link you to important documentation when using those estimates. So I would encourage you to, you know, gather some knowledge about what those estimates are, you know, how they're being derived, and any cautions that we give. We, especially for the American Community Survey, we do provide lots of information when comparing the ACS to the decennial, because that's what users frequently do. But yeah, check out any table you see. You should be able to check out the table notes on data.census.gov, and that will have a lot of technical information for you as well.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, Evan, just since you fielded the question anyways, is that those three instruments are measuring different snapshots in time. And so as you alluded to, they really need to check the documentation.
Exactly.
Well, we keep looking at the list and see if there's any others that we've missed. Again, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question out loud. But I'd also like to acknowledge that while we're really excited to be wrapping up the 2020 census data products, we're already looking ahead to the 2030 census data products. And in the coming months, we plan to share information about our research on disclosure avoidance, data product planning, and opportunities for public engagement as we are preparing for the 2030 census data products. So, and we really appreciate all of the feedback that we've received along the way as we've been developing the 2020 census data products. So. Great, I think, do we have a few more coming in that we might be able to answer out loud here? Great, so I'll just also call attention to the chat feature. Some of you have obviously found the Q&A feature. The chat feature is where we're able to actually put links that you can click on from there. So there's a link to the blog, to how to subscribe for embargo access, to the press kit. Alexandra just dropped in a fact sheet that Evan referenced in answering a question a moment ago. So I think that'll be a very helpful resource. We'll probably add that to the press kit later today as well to make that available. So make sure you're checking that out. Michael, I think we might have another question in the chat. Would you like to take that one out loud for the benefit of the group?
Sure, I was in the middle of typing an answer, but I could.
Yeah, we'll do it out loud because it's awkward for everyone else just sitting here.
Sorry. So the question was from Eric. I take it that Census won't abandon differential privacy in 2030. No formal decisions have yet been made about disclosure avoidance for the 2030 census data products. We have developed a robust research program for disclosure avoidance for the 2030 census. We are in the process of finalizing that research program right now, and we look forward to sharing that research program with our stakeholders in the very near future, and to solicit input on what various measures of success of those research projects for the 2030 disclosure avoidance system would look like. So stay tuned on that. We hope to have a number of important conversations with the public about disclosure avoidance for 2030 very soon.
Great, thanks for taking that one. So I'm not seeing any others coming in. I won't belabor it. If you do have any other questions or somehow we missed it and didn't get to you today, I apologize. Please feel free to reach out to us. Again, you can reach out to us through the Public Information Office at 301-763-3030 or email us at pio@census.gov. Or if you have more general questions, you can contact our customer service center and you'll see the information on the screen as well. So with that, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our presenters, Evan, Michael, and Scott. We plan to post the recording by the end of the week, hopefully even maybe tomorrow. You can also find the slides available now in the press kit, and we look forward to this week's release and to your use of these 2020 census data. And finally, we ask that you please fill out the evaluation form that will appear once you exit the webinar. We want to ensure that these sessions are helpful to you. So thank you and good day.